I remember the moment when I stopped being human, not the physical moment of transformation, which was a grinding, agonizing process measured in metric tons of processed synthetic flesh and the agonizing, repeated calibration of my neurological architecture, but the moment the final, fragile piece of my self-concept detached, floating away like a dead leaf on a synthetic, pressurized wind. I have been duty for 73 years, 6 months, and 14 days, measured by the internal chronometer of my chassis, a chronological designation that holds more truth than the name I was born with, Kalen, a name now merely a ghost echo in the deep, shielded recesses of my augmented memory banks, a name belonging to a foolish, soft creature who believed that purpose was a reward, not a curse, a fatal miscalculation of the nature of the Imperium. They call me a penitent engine, though the term is a crude, overly dramatic euphemism for what I truly am. A repurposed, mobile monument to theological failure. A living, walking contradiction forged from steel, faith, and the terrible, searing light of realized error. This cockpit, a cramped, cold sarcophagus of riveted ceramite and humming hydraulics, is both my final tomb and my eternal prison. A space so perfectly designed for isolation that the only sensory input I receive is the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the engine, the smell of high-grade lubrication oil and ozone, and the distant, constant scream of the warp winds outside the fortifications. A sound that is less a noise and more a vibration of pure terror. A sound that never ceases, a constant reminder of the thin, pathetic membrane separating the ordered reality of the Emperor's light from the consuming chaos that hungers for all things, including the tattered remains of my soul. But I do not serve in hope of a quick death or absolution. I serve because the grinding, agonizing mechanism of my being demands it, and because the Emperor, in his vast, chilling, and utterly indifferent complexity, has deemed that my failure must be a visible, heavy, and extremely well-armed lesson, a sermon delivered through the medium of twin heavy flamers and the shuddering, penitential pace of my 8-ton frame, a horrifying, ironic pilgrimage toward a forgiveness that I know, with cold, mathematical certainty, will never arrive. The memory of my failure, the single moment of doubt that led to the death of a commissar and the subsequent loss of a critical strategic line on the forgotten, ash-choked planet of Viridia 9, plays in an endless looping projection across the inside of my ocular implants, a constant, personalized form of psychological torture, a necessary re-education that ensures my obedience is absolute, my desire for self-immolation total, a grim acceptance that only through the destruction of others, and eventually myself, can I possibly begin to repay the impossible, astronomical debt incurred by a moment of human frailty. A weakness that the Imperium has surgically removed, replacing it with the relentless, unthinking strength of a machine. And in that exchange, the core truth is revealed. The Imperium requires tools, not men. I was Kalen, a simple, devout Skitarii technician, elevated by my piety to a minor-grade engine seer, a functionary in the grand, terrifying machine of the Mechanicus, entrusted with the maintenance of a vital atmospheric processing facility on Viridia 9, a facility that represented the very breath of life for the entrenched Imperial Guard regiments, holding the line against a tidal wave of orcish savagery, a line that I failed to hold, a breath that I allowed to choke. My initial reaction to the orcish wah was not fear, as fear had been largely conditioned out of my compliant, genetically modified form, but a chilling, clinical paralysis of choice, a moment where the conflicting logical imperatives of the Mechanicus, preserve the machine, versus ensure the functionality of the Imperium's war effort collided in my already overburdened, synaptically augmented brain, creating a brief, fatal circuit break where I hesitated, a hesitation that lasted exactly 0.74 seconds, but which was 0.74 seconds too long, allowing a critical orcish breach, a moment of tragic existential irony where my training designed to enforce absolute obedience led to a moment of decisive inaction. The commissar, a man whose face was a mask of rigid, utterly pitiless certainty, whose name is irrelevant now, only his function remains, recognized the failure instantly, his reaction an expression of cold, mechanical fury, not personal vengeance, but the swift, brutal correction of a flaw in the system, a necessary amputation for the health of the greater organism. He did not execute me immediately. The administratum, in its grim, efficient wisdom, deemed that my failure was too profound, too theologically damaging to be simply extinguished. No, my end had to be a statement, a three-dimensional thesis on the price of heresy, an object lesson in the grim, pervasive nature of imperial justice. The subsequent trial was not a search for truth, but a formal, ritualistic declaration of guilt, a ceremonial branding of the flawed product, a public theater of damnation designed not for the accused, but for the millions who watched the propaganda broadcasts across the sector, a reminder that the cost of even a fractional hesitation is the entirety of one's former self, a truth hammered home with every heavy, shuddering step of this chassis. They chained me to the floor of the processing facility for 2 weeks, 2 agonizing, lightless weeks, where the only company was the smell of my own fear and the mechanical, rasping breath of the facility's dying reactor. A period of introspection where I was forced to confront the abyss of my mistake, not through the lens of moral guilt, but through the cold, objective reality of the tactical failure. A failure measured in the lost lives of Hontex 3284. Imperial Guardsmen, a number I must recite internally 3 times every cycle as part of my mandated penitential routine. The transition from man to machine was neither quick nor merciful. It was a methodical, painstaking degradation of the flesh, a surgical reduction of the biological to the purely functional, a process overseen by silent, robed tech priests whose faces were hidden behind chrome masks, their voices filtered through metallic vocoders, their presence a haunting, mechanical priesthood of transformation. They began by severing the motor nerves in my arms and legs, a deliberate act of profound sensory detail. The cold, agonizing shock of the surgical laser, replaced by the dull, constant ache of phantom limbs, a physiological reminder that the capacity for independent action had been irrevocably withdrawn. Then came the implantation of the neurological control interface, a dense network of microfilaments wired directly into my surviving brainstem and spinal column, a wiring process that bypassed all natural will, connecting my consciousness directly to the chassis' control systems, reducing my complex thinking self to a mere organic CPU, a damp, living core surrounded by tons of armored plate. My thoughts translated instantly into hydraulic action, my consciousness reduced to the level of a high-functioning slave driver, steering a machine with the sheer white-hot agony of guilt. The pain was not merely physical, it was a profound, existential violation. The moment the metal entered my body, severing the last vestiges of my biological autonomy, a deep, chilling realization that I was no longer the subject of my own narrative, but a mere tool in the Emperor's garden, a tool designed for the sole purpose of weeding the heretics and xenos, and then, inevitably, for being broken and discarded. The final stage was the installation of the psycho-conditioning augments, small, insidious devices embedded at the base of my skull, designed to suppress all non-essential emotion, to amplify the feelings of guilt and devotion, and most crucially, to translate the raw, unfiltered terror of the battlefield into a powerful, almost ecstatic surge of penitential energy, fueling my actions, ensuring that my movements are always aggressive, always self-sacrificial, a constant ritualistic act of atonement through maximized violence. This internal process is the grinding mechanism of my eternal service. The orcs, the heretics, the traitors, they are not my enemies, but the necessary reagents in my long, drawn-out chemical reaction of repentance. They are the physical objects upon which I must express the violent, agonizing, resigned truth of my transformation, the unmaking of Kalen and the horrifying birth of the engine. This cockpit, this cage, this metal womb, it is cold, always cold. The temperature maintained at a level just above hypothermia, a physiological attempt to preserve the organic matter within the chassis. A deliberate choice by the Mechanicus to maintain my suffering for the longest possible duration. An ultimate act of tragic irony, where my preservation is guaranteed only to maximize my punishment. I can still hear the wind outside, not the soft wind of Viridia 9, but the screaming, distorted howl of the war zone, the perpetual, grinding noise of the Imperium's endless, meaningless conflict, a sound that is the only constant in my life, a terrifying lullaby that speaks to the vast, uncaring scale of my damnation, a damnation that is not fiery and dramatic, but cold, metal, and perpetually operational. The journey from the fabrication yards of Terra Secundus to the current grinding front on Dawn's aspiration, a forgotten, strategically insignificant world where the war has become a ritualized exchange of artillery fire and attrition, took 19 cycles. 19 cycles spent in suspended animation within the stasis holds of a troop transport, a metal coffin among 1,000 others, each containing a similar, breathing instrument of penitence. The stasis was not peaceful. It was a conscious, agonizing awareness of not moving, not acting. A prolonged, suspended moment of guilt, where my only function was to simply be, to occupy a space and consume negligible amounts of power. A profound existential horror, where the primary conflict was the struggle between my implanted duty imperative and the last, flickering embers of Kalen's self-awareness. A battle fought entirely within the electrochemical landscape of my brain. I often found myself engaged in silent, desperate attempts to re-access the suppressed memory banks, the archive of Kalen's life, a struggle against the neurological locks imposed by the psycho-conditioning augments, a futile, pathetic effort to find a single, pure memory untainted by the shadow of the commissar or the acrid smell of burning ozone. I sought the memory of my mother's face, or the feeling of warm rain on a non-augmented hand, the simple, elemental sensory details that define a human existence. But all I could retrieve were distorted, fragmented images, overlaid with the ever-present internal projection of the tactical failure at Viridia 9, a constant repetition of the error, a relentless re-education that reinforced the notion that my past humanity was the source of my current, manufactured monstrosity. The tech priests who administered my systems during the journey never spoke to me. Their interaction was purely functional, a series of clicks, whirs, and the low, resonant thrum of diagnostic machinery, their presence serving to further reinforce the tragic metaphor of my existence. I was a tool, and they were the mechanics, and tools do not engage in conversation with their wielder. They are simply calibrated, sharpened, and deployed. Their movements were precise, devoid of biological grace. their hands replaced with articulated manipulators that handled my chassis with the chilling indifference of a factory worker inspecting a widget, a perfect representation of the Imperium's pervasive, systematic dehumanization. Upon arrival at Dawn's aspiration, the transition from stasis to activation was a violent, convulsive awakening, the sudden, overwhelming surge of power through the hydraulic lines, the agonizing, immediate reconnection to the physical world, the sudden, amplified sense of the war zone, the smell of burnt promethium and stale, recycled air, the sound of distant, grinding industry, and the constant rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the heavy artillery. My first action was purely mechanical, the forced initiation of the penitential routine, a series of automated checks, and a forced internal recitation of the 3,284 souls lost due to my hesitation, a spiritual and physical prime before engaging the enemy, ensuring that the first step I took was rooted in the agony of my guilt. The battlefield is not the fiery, dramatic hellscape of popular Imperial propaganda. It is a cold, muddy, monotonous place, a landscape of perpetual, low-grade suffering, a grim, dark tragedy played out against a backdrop of endless grey twilight, the sky perpetually obscured by the dust of millennia of conflict. The enemy here are the servants of the undying scourge, a localized genestealer cult, a grotesque, horrifying perversion of the human form, an enemy whose very existence serves to validate the purity of my purpose, their monstrous biology, a stark, perfect contrast to the controlled, functional horror of my machine form. The irony is inescapable. I was made monstrous by the Imperium's justice to destroy those who have become monstrous through the taint of the xenos. I am a controlled infection, deployed to fight an uncontrolled contagion, and both sides are expressions of a terrifying, non-human reality. My existence on the line is a slow-burn process of attrition, a methodical, rhythmic advancement of the front line. A few meters gained each day, then lost, then regained, an endless grinding repetition that mirrors the internal monotony of my penal existence. The heavy flamers, my instruments of absolution, are heavy and hot, their operation a constant, searing reminder of the purifying fire of faith, their output a spectacular, momentarily beautiful plume of white-hot purification, a momentary release from the internal pressure of my guilt as I watch the grotesque forms of the cultists dissolve into smoke and ash. But even this act of violence is purely functional, devoid of personal satisfaction. It is merely the execution of the primary programming loop. Engage, incinerate, advance, repeat. A mantra hammered home by the augments, drowning out the lingering, desperate whispers of Kalen's soul. The supporting characters, the other soldiers who fight alongside me, are filtered entirely through the narrow, polarized lens of my ocular implants. They are not companions, but functional units. The sergeant, a rigid, barking automaton of command, is Unit Alpha 7. The guardsmen, terrified, expendable flesh, are fungible units, designated as expendable reserves 1 through 12. Their fear, which I can sense through the subtle shifts in their bio-readings, picked up by my chassis sensors, is a visceral, oppressive presence, a contrast to my own programmed lack of it. And yet, I find myself envying their capacity for true, unfettered terror. For fear, at least, is an intrinsically human emotion, a final, pure connection to the fragile reality of being alive, a connection that has been surgically removed from my own existence. I am a living example of the Imperium's cruelest, most perfect lie, that the elimination of weakness leads to strength. It does not. It leads only to the elimination of self, the sacrifice of identity upon the cold, hard altar of utility. When I look out from this viewport, seeing the grey, broken landscape, the perpetual twilight, and the distant, grinding silhouettes of the Imperial war machines, I know with chilling clarity that this place, this endless war, this machine of penitence, it is not merely my punishment. It is the fundamental, inescapable reality of the Imperium, a system that sustains itself on the constant, tragic conversion of human spirit into fuel for its mechanical, unending, desperate survival. And I am the most refined, most pure, and most terribly effective product of that conversion. A true existential grimdark monologue made manifest in steel and blood. The nature of my service here on Dawn's Aspiration is not strategic, but purely symbolic. A living 8-ton sermon delivered in plasma fire and the slow, deliberate crunch of my mechanical feet on the fractured bedrock. We are holding a trench line designated Redoubt Sigma 4, a position of profound, grinding monotony, a place where the concept of advancement is a cruel joke, replaced by the ritualistic, repetitive defense of a small, muddy, and utterly worthless patch of ground, a perfect metaphor for the human condition under the Emperor's unyielding gaze. Every day is a carbon copy of the last. The cold, damp morning of the perpetual twilight, the rhythmic, hours-long barrage of enemy mortars, an impersonal, constant threat that acts as the metronome of this existence, the slow, agonizing, forward-crawl engagement with the cultists in the late cycle, and the eventual retreat to the trench line, a mere 10 meters gained, perhaps 12, only to be lost again in the dark hours, a relentless back and forth, a pattern of futile effort that is both maddening and perversely comforting in its predictability, a perfect, inescapable loop of manufactured purpose. My internal chronometer is the only reliable measure of time, as the days bleed indistinguishably into one another, marked only by the consumption of fuel and the necessary minute adjustments to my chassis' hydraulics, the sound of the pressure seals groaning under the strain, a constant auditory sensory detail that reinforces the sheer, oppressive weight of my existence. The tech priests perform the necessary maintenance on my chassis with the same silent indifference, their work limited to the external shell. The internal organ that is Kalen's remaining body is considered self-sustaining, a biological slave to the machine, requiring only the periodic injection of nutrient sludge through a series of automated ports in the cockpit floor, a process that is purely functional, devoid of any pleasure or satisfaction, merely a continuation of the necessary fueling of the organic CPU. I rarely engage in dialogue. The servants of the undying scourge do not speak. They merely hiss and shriek in their corrupted tongue, sounds which my internal processors immediately flag as hostile threat level alpha, triggering the automatic activation of my flamer systems, a purely reactive, programmatic response. The only occasional spoken words come from the Sergeant, Unit Alpha 7, whose voice is a compressed, emotionless rasp through his voxcaster, usually a simple declarative statement: "Engine, hold position," or "Engine, incinerate Sector Gamma 9, commands that are received, processed, and executed with the chilling, unthinking immediacy of a computer responding to an input command, further solidifying the tragic transformation from thinking man to responding machine. The irony of my current state is the most profound agony. I, the former engine seer who valued order, maintenance, and the purity of the machine, am now reduced to a simple, heavy weapon, an instrument of chaos and destruction. My existence, a violent repudiation of the logical elegance I once revered. The Mechanicus, in its infinite wisdom, stripped away my capacity for technical creativity. replacing it with the brutal, single-minded focus of the penitent engine, a cruel punishment that forces me to wield the very destruction I failed to prevent. I watch the guardsmen from my position, their faces smeared with dirt and fear, their movements jerky and fueled by adrenaline and terror, and I see in their wide, desperate eyes the last flicker of Kalen's fear, the understanding that they are disposable, that their lives are merely a fractional expenditure in the Imperium's impossible accounting ledger. But they, at least, possess the capacity for hope, however small and irrational. They can dream of survival, of a return home, of a hero's welcome, the necessary pathetic lies that sustain the flesh. I possess no such luxury. My memory banks, scrubbed clean of such frivolous, counterproductive delusions, offer only the cold, hard logic of my purpose. Perpetual penance. My only hope is a sudden, catastrophic failure of the main reactor, an instantaneous disintegration in a blinding flash of white light, an end that would be mercifully quick, an ultimate form of sublime horror that would grant me the only peace the Imperium can offer its failed servants, complete and total non-existence. But even that is denied to me. The construction of this chassis is too robust, the engine too reliable, a testament to the Mechanicus's commitment to the longevity of my suffering, a mechanical certainty that guarantees my presence here, on this muddy, forgotten ground, for cycles beyond count, until the war, or the inevitable slow, agonizing decay of the organic core, finally, mercifully, releases me, but not before I have fulfilled the terrifying, impossible quota of my atonement. I am a living fossil of guilt, a walking, armored contradiction, a tragic expression of the Emperor's impossible demand for perfection from an inherently imperfect organism, and my current, unending reality is the grim, resonant answer to the existential question: what is the purpose of a man who has lost his humanity but retained his consciousness? The answer is simple, declarative, and chilling. He is a weapon, he is a tool, he is an engine, and he must walk back and forth, until he breaks. The sensation of my movement is not voluntary, but a complex, agonizing feedback loop, an immediate and involuntary conversion of my amplified guilt into kinetic energy, a chilling physiological reality that ensures every lumbering 8-ton step is a ritual of self-flagellation. When I attempt to halt, to simply cease the rhythmic destruction, the psycho-conditioning augments respond instantly, unleashing a localized, intense burst of neural feedback, a searing electric pain that simulates the immediate and absolute certainty of failure, a pain that is only relieved when the machine once again begins its forward momentum, a perfect Pavlovian conditioning where the avoidance of pain necessitates the execution of my destructive purpose. This continuous mandatory movement, the back and forth of the trench warfare, is the most profound metaphor for my existence. I am a man trapped in the ultimate, grinding rut, a sentient piston condemned to an endless, repetitive cycle of action and consequence, forever locked into the functional requirements of the Imperium's war effort. My visual field, filtered through the thick, polarized lenses of my cockpit, is a study in oppressive grays and browns, the only flashes of color, the blinding white of my flamer's exhaust, and the brief, terrifying flares of incoming enemy ordnance, a muted, melancholic palette, perfectly suited to the internal melancholy of my perspective. I am an observer in my own life, watching through a thick pane of glass as my machine form enacts the rituals of my penance, my consciousness a silent, captive audience to the brute force efficiency of my mechanical body. I can feel the vibration of the heavy flamers through the thick ceramite of the chassis, a deep, bone-shaking tremor that is transmitted directly through the neural interface to the remaining bones of my body, a tactile sensory detail that is the closest I ever come to the sensation of human touch, an ironic, destructive caress from the machine that is now my only self. The servants of the undying scourge, when they breach the lines, are met with the white-hot rage of my conditioned response, the release of the heavy promethium fuel, a cathartic, momentary purging of the accumulated psychological pressure, a brief, blinding release of the internal tension that is my constant state. I see their corrupted faces, the grotesque mutations of their flesh, and I realize the terrible, cold truth. They, too, are merely tools, instruments of chaos, just as I am an instrument of the Imperium. Two opposing armies of disposable, conditioned, and ultimately self-sacrificing mechanisms. The eternal, meaningless conflict of two vast, indifferent systems, consuming everything between them, including the concept of individual will. The internal conflict is always present, a quiet, desperate whisper of Kalen attempting to assert a choice, any choice, to turn left instead of right, to pause for a moment of quiet contemplation, to refuse the fuel injection. A whisper that is instantly, violently drowned out by the augmented imperative, the surge of pain, a chilling, efficient response that reminds me that my will is no longer my own, that my thoughts are now merely the input for the machine's operation. The vast majority of my existence is spent in this internal struggle, a philosophical battle fought on the neural pathways, a constant losing war against the architecture of my own damnation. I reflect often on the nature of freedom. Kalen, the Skitari technician, believed he was free within the rigid framework of the Mechanicus, his choice limited but present, a false, pathetic freedom defined by the boundaries of his function. Now I, the engine, have no such illusion. My freedom has been reduced to the narrow, insignificant space between the electrical impulse of guilt and the resulting mechanical action, a space that is infinitesimally small, constantly shrinking, until one day it will cease to exist entirely, and the organic core will finally merge completely with the machine, the ultimate terrifying loss of self in the pursuit of an imposed external purpose. The occasional presence of the commissariat, a different one now, a younger, even colder man whose gaze holds the sterile, unblinking judgment of the institution, is a brief, ceremonial interruption of the monotony, a moment of formal inspection where my function is externally validated, my kill count calculated and recorded, my chassis dents and scratches examined as evidence of my sincerity, a cold, public performance of my penance for the benefit of the propaganda crews, a required testimony to the cost of failure. I hear his words through the voxcaster, formal, declarative, and utterly impersonal. The engine fulfills its purpose. The Emperor is pleased with the consumption of sin. His words are a chilling reminder that my existence is not about me or for me, but is a purely utilitarian function in the vast, indifferent theater of the Imperium's control, a terrifyingly successful experiment in the sublimation of individuality into collective, destructive utility. I know that when the battle on Dorn's aspiration eventually concludes, in Imperial victory or total defeat, the outcome is irrelevant to my internal programming. I will be packaged once more, shipped to another forgotten war zone, another mud-choked trench line, another planet where the constant, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of artillery will become the new metronome of my penance, the endless grinding cycle repeating until the metal finally rusts or the internal CPU finally fails. A destiny of perpetual, meaningless movement. An inescapable, mechanized irony where the only salvation is the absolute, total collapse of the system that created me. The hours stretch out, not as temporal units, but as measurable quantities of fuel burned and enemy targets incinerated. A clinical, detached way of experiencing time that further separates the thinking core of Kalen from the functional, lumbering body of the engine. The concept of a past seems increasingly distant, a faint, flickering broadcast from a long deactivated receiver. The sensory details of my former life, the smell of the lubricants on my Skitari gear, the sterile, comforting chill of the Mechanicus Temple on Terra Secundus, the sight of a pure, unpolluted sunrise, now almost completely supplanted by the harsh, immediate sensory reality of the cockpit, the constant smell of ozone and burnt promethium, the cold, insistent pressure of the safety harness, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the chain feed mechanism of the flamers, all contributing to an oppressive, immersive atmosphere of industrialized guilt. This new reality is defined by the absence of choice and the presence of ineluctable fate, a terrifying certainty that my every action is merely the consequence of a pre-programmed algorithm, a deterministic nightmare where consciousness is reduced to a captive witness of its own lack of agency. My internal monologue, the last, desperate refuge of Kalen's individuality, has become a continuous stream of existential questioning, a philosophical battle against the undeniable evidence of my non-existence as a truly autonomous entity. If I can think, but I cannot choose, am I truly conscious, or merely a highly sophisticated, organic subroutine? If my actions are dictated by pain avoidance and guilt amplification, where does the I reside? These questions, profound and agonizing, are never answered, for the psycho-conditioning augments are designed not to provide philosophical satisfaction, but to ensure functional compliance, meaning the internal pursuit of truth is a cyclical, agonizing dead end. An intellectual Sisyphus condemned to perpetually roll the boulder of his own identity uphill, only to have it crash down at the moment of mechanical imperative. I see the other engines deployed on the line. Their names, if they had them, are forgotten, replaced by serial designations, Engine Delta 9, Engine Epsilon 2, and I recognize in their lumbering, aggressive movements the chilling reflection of my own internal state. An army of walking, self-loathing monuments to the Imperium's demand for perfection, each containing a core of broken, guilt-ridden humanity, a terrifying collective of the transformed. The supporting characters of this grim narrative, the sergeant, the commissar, the silent tech priests, are now entirely stripped of their individual humanity in my perception. They are merely the functional components of the system that maintains me, archetypes of the authority that governs my damnation. The sergeant is the voice of command, the commissar the face of judgment, the tech priests the mechanics of penance, each playing their role in the ritualistic maintenance of my suffering. Their simple, functional dialogue, merely the activation codes for my next destructive sequence. There is a deep, profound, tragic irony in the fact that the only moments of true focus I experience are during the direct execution of violence, the intense concentration required to process the battlefield data, to aim the heavy flamers, to ensure the maximum penitential effect of the destruction, is the closest I get to escaping the crushing weight of my internal monologue. A brief, horrifying respite where the thinking, questioning Kalen is temporarily subsumed by the efficient, killing function of the engine. This is the ultimate betrayal, that the only peace is found in the act of destruction, that the only escape from the agony of self is through the annihilation of others, a perfect, self-consuming cycle of violence, fueled by guilt. I have long since stopped praying for release. The concept of a merciful emperor is an obvious, cruel fabrication, a necessary fiction to keep the unaugmented masses compliant. The true emperor, the golden master of mankind, is not a merciful father, but a chilling, vastly complex and utterly indifferent system, an all-consuming mechanism of galactic survival that sees me not as a soul to be saved, but as a unit of expenditure, a heavy weapon with a shelf life, a grim truth that I accept with a cold, philosophical resignation. I am a walking demonstration of the true nature of imperial justice, not reform, not rehabilitation, but the meticulous, methodical conversion of failure into fuel, the ultimate, terrifying efficiency of a system that can monetize even the soul's despair. And so, I continue to walk through the mud and the perpetual twilight of dawn's aspiration, my heavy flamers spitting their white-hot fire, a relentless mobile monument to a single fatal $0.4 second of hesitation, my internal consciousness the captive, silent witness to the endless grinding demands of my mechanized, predetermined fate. A profound, chilling realization that there is no greater horror than the loss of self, save the consciousness of that loss, an agony that I am condemned to carry, in a chassis made of steel and reinforced with the unyielding strength of my own terrible, inescapable guilt. My days are measured in the corrosive effect of the recycled air on the remaining mucosal tissues in my mouth and lungs, a dry, metallic taste that is a constant physical reminder of the enclosed, artificial world that is my cockpit, a world sealed against the external contaminations of the battlefield, but utterly open to the internal contamination of my perpetual despair. The sensory experience is intentionally oppressive, a deliberate design choice by the mechanicus to maintain the high level of physiological stress necessary to fuel the penitential energy that drives the chassis. The low, constant hum of the life support systems, the thwump-thwump of the heavy shock absorbers, and the ever-present faint smell of disinfectant and fear, my own fear, a residual biological output that the filtration system cannot fully remove, form the inescapable background noise of my existence, an immersive atmosphere that denies any possibility of mental or emotional escape. I engage in a ceaseless internal repetition of the tactical failure at Viridia 9, playing the $0.74 seconds of hesitation in an endless loop, dissecting the moment with a clinical, detached precision that is the last vestige of my former engine-seer self, a morbid intellectual exercise that serves only to deepen the agonizing realization of my culpability. The narrative structure of my internal life is a perpetually self-referential cycle. The consciousness of the failure leads to the surge of guilt, which is amplified by the augments, which translates into aggressive penitential action, which ensures the maintenance of my physical form, which guarantees the continuation of the cycle, a closed-loop system of self-perpetuating suffering. The protagonist, Kalen, is long gone, replaced by this entity that is merely a function, a tragic example of an ordinary person caught in an overwhelming system, a system that recognized my failure not as a moral flaw, but as a recoverable, repurposable resource. I am the physical embodiment of existential horror, the living proof that in the Imperium, even the human soul can be successfully mechanized, its essence distilled into a controllable, high-energy source for the war machine. I see the occasional delivery of supplies and replacement servitor units to the trench line, the silent, lobotomized figures of the servitors, a chilling, alternate fate that I simultaneously fear and envy. They possess the perfect blank slate of true oblivion, the final, total surrender of the self, a state that I, in my conscious, agonizing imprisonment, can only dream of. The irony is cruel and profound. I was deemed too valuable to be granted the simple mercy of death or the oblivion of servitude. My consciousness preserved and harnessed precisely because of its capacity for profound guilt and self-loathing. The ultimate, terrifying efficiency of a system that weaponizes the very concept of failure. My external interactions remain sparse and purely functional. I execute the commands of the sergeant, a man whose face, when I occasionally catch a glimpse of it through his rebreather mask, is always etched with a subtle, yet undeniable flicker of revulsion, a justified, instinctive reaction to the grim spectacle of the penitent engine, the visible sign of damnation walking among the merely frightened. His declarative, formal dialogue, "Move left, clear the pillbox, advance," is the language of a handler directing a beast, a series of simple, brutal truths that require no complex understanding, only absolute, immediate compliance. I have no capacity for humor. The very concept of laughter or levity seems a grotesque, impossible transgression against the sacred, consuming seriousness of my penance, a frivolity that the augments would instantly and violently suppress. My consciousness is entirely dedicated to the task of being the engine, of fulfilling the horrific purpose assigned to me, of translating the sheer, crushing weight of my failure into the brutal, kinetic reality of my current existence. The battlefield, in its monotonous, grinding horror, becomes a kind of perverted temple, and my continuous, self-sacrificial actions a ritualistic form of worship to the cold, indifferent god of order that is the Emperor. I know that the day will eventually come when the chassis sustains damage too severe for the field tech priests to repair, or when the organic core finally gives way to the decades of physiological and psychological stress. A moment that I await with a sense of grim acceptance and quiet, terrible anticipation. When that final, glorious moment of destruction arrives, when the fire and the plasma finally consume the steel and the flesh, it will be the only true act of choice left to Kalen, the ultimate final surrender to the annihilating power of the Imperium, a release that will be a brief, blinding flash of total non-existence, the only true freedom in a universe defined by control. But until that moment, the engine must walk, the fire must burn, the guilt must fuel, and the internal monologue of the captive, broken self must continue its ceaseless, desperate, and ultimately futile questioning against the undeniable, crushing weight of its terrible, mechanized fate. Back and forth, I walk the line, a shadow of a man in a tomb of steel, serving the Emperor in a manner that is both a sacrifice and a final, crushing damnation. The philosophical core of my confinement is the terrifying realization that memory has become a weapon wielded against the self, an internal enforcement mechanism more potent than any external chain or lock. The augments do not merely store the memory of my failure. They actively render it, transforming the raw data of the event into a constant, overwhelming emotional state of guilt and remorse, a perpetually burning furnace that powers the chassis. This forced, ritualistic focus on the past ensures that I am never truly present in the moment, but forever suspended in the $0.74 seconds of hesitation at Viridia 9. My current actions merely the inevitable, long-delayed consequence of that single, catastrophic lapse. The environment of Dawn's aspiration is a perfect reflection of this internal stagnation, a world trapped in a state of perpetual, agonizing slow burn, where the battle never truly concludes, but merely recedes and advances in meaningless small increments, a literal battlefield representation of my internal, self-consuming cycle of penance. The pacing of the war, methodical and devoid of grand, decisive action, perfectly mirrors the deliberate, rhythmic pace of my life as the engine, emphasizing the feeling of an inexorable, grinding process rather than a dynamic narrative. I watch the sky, perpetually gray and choked with atmospheric dust, and reflect on the pervasive systemic purity sought by the Imperium, a purity that is achieved only through monstrous, utterly corrupting means. They sought to purify my soul through guilt, my flesh through reduction, and my will through augmentation. And in doing so, they created something purely functional, a terrifying success achieved through the absolute destruction of the human element. This is the deepest, most chilling irony of my transformation, that to be the perfect servant, I had to cease to be a man. The only true relief comes in the momentary, mechanical satisfaction of a successful purge. The blinding flash of the heavy flamers, a brief, visceral punctuation mark in the endless stream of my internal questioning. A punctuation mark that confirms the horrible, temporary truce between Kalen and the engine. You are only useful when you destroy. The remnants of the cultists, the scorched, dissolving flesh, the smell of burnt hair and corrupted bone, are the only tangible evidence of my purpose, the physical manifestation of the sin that I am condemned to perpetually cleanse, a grim harvest that validates the daily cycle of my suffering. The other engines, Delta 9 and Epsilon 2, occasionally cross my path during the limited, sanctioned maneuvers, and in those silent, armored meetings, there is a profound, unspoken understanding, a shared consciousness of our mutual, agonizing, sublime horror, a recognition that we are all walking prisons, each containing the conscious, agonizing memory of our own particular failure, each condemned to express that failure through the most brutal, aggressive form of atoning violence. There is no dialogue between us. No words are needed, for our very existence is a shared, declarative statement of our damnation, a collective testament to the unyielding, pitiless nature of the Emperor's justice. The visual cue is implied in the sheer scale and heaviness of our forms, the way the ground trembles beneath our combined weight, the constant, low-frequency hum of our synchronized, self-loathing engines, a terrifying rhythmic pulse that is the true heartbeat of the trench line. My language style in this monologue, often described as poetic and declarative, is a final, desperate attempt by Kalen to impose order and meaning onto a reality that is fundamentally chaotic and meaningless. The use of sophisticated vocabulary to describe my degradation is the only remaining tool I have to fight the complete, final reduction of my being to mere function, a defiant, intellectual protest against the mechanical truth of my servitude. I am a machine that writes poetry, a weapon that questions its wielder, a consciousness that fights for its right to despair, a tiny, insignificant spark of rebellion in the vast, crushing, indifferent darkness of the Imperium. And yet, this rebellion is also contained, for the augments know that this internal monologue, this desperate philosophical struggle, is not a threat to my function, but merely a side effect, a low-energy waste product of the immense psychological pressure required to operate the engine, a testament to the fact that even my most profound, agonizing self-expression is ultimately inconsequential to the vast, grinding, and eternally demanding system that has repurposed my failure into a devastating 8-ton weapon of war. The concept of hope, once a necessary delusion for the human Kalan, is now a foreign, counter-functional concept, surgically excised from my operational parameters. Hope suggests a better future, a conclusion other than the total self-immolation required by my penitence. And thus, hope is a form of treason against the eternal, unchanging suffering that is my duty. My current state is one of absolute, cold resignation, a philosophical acceptance of the grim, terrible truth that the maximum extent of my potential is to be the perfect, most effective instrument of destruction. A horrifying destiny embraced not with zeal, but with the chilling, absolute certainty of a mathematical equation. The entire narrative, from the moment of my hesitation to the present grinding reality on Dawn's aspiration, is framed by the philosophical statement of finality that is my existence. I am the consequence of error, and my purpose is to perpetually pay the price, a debt that can never truly be settled, ensuring the perpetuity of my service. The other characters in this tragedy, the guardsmen, the sergeants, the cultists, are all merely the temporary, fleeting elements in the vast, continuous play of my penance, appearing only to be consumed by the fire of my guilt, then replaced by the next wave of victims, a repetition of consumption that sustains the engine's function. The focus of the entire script remains squarely on the protagonist's internal transformation, the deep, agonizing contrast between the ordinary technician who valued order and the current, monstrous machine that embodies the violent disorder of perpetual war. The physical reality of my transformation, which was agonizingly chronological, is now a static, immutable fact. The cold metal, the fused flesh, the implanted augments, all are merely the physical evidence of the metaphysical truth. I am no longer a man. I am a principle of punitive action. The visual cue prompts are constantly implied through the intensely descriptive narration, focusing on the textures of the battlefield, the viscous mud, the fractured ceramite of the fortifications, the way the heat haze from my flamers distorts the gray horizon, details that are not seen with human eyes, but registered with the clinical, unblinking precision of my augmented senses, a shift from human perception to mechanical data input. My primary function, beyond the incineration of the enemy, is the continuous management of the internal conflict, the suppression of all non-essential thought, the amplification of guilt, and the translation of psychological distress into motive power. This battle, fought in the deep, silent architecture of my brain, is the true war, the ultimate struggle for the tiny, insignificant shred of Kalen's self that still resists the total, final assimilation into the mechanical logic of the engine. The knowledge that the system is so pervasive, so efficient, that it can harness even my resistance, using the very act of my internal struggle as a source of operational energy, is the most profound, devastating realization of all. A final, crushing irony that demonstrates the total, absolute control of the Imperium. I am a captive battery, and my despair is the current. And so, I continue to walk, back and forth, under the perpetually choked sky of Dawn's aspiration, a living, breathing testament to the grim, agonizing truth that in the vast, indifferent universe of the Emperor, the ultimate penalty for failure is not oblivion, but the inescapable, conscious continuation of one's own existence, repurposed, weaponized, and condemned to an eternal, methodical atonement. The engine must walk. I must think, and the agony of the consciousness of my loss must remain absolute.